A man with 10 children can't avoid a concern about the future. It's underfoot most of the time.
All right.
I caught you, Daddy.
Attorney General will say a few words. I just want to say to all of you how much my wife and I appreciate the opportunity to meet you. Unfortunately, as we walked through the line, we didn't have an opportunity to shake hands with everybody. So, louder. As the candidate, you got it as loud as I can go. Let me say this.
Many leading members of the Democratic and the Liberal parties here in the state of New York have talked to me about being a candidate for the United States Senate. So if nominated by the Democratic State Convention, I shall resign from the cabinet to campaign for election. I shall devote all of my effort and all whatever talents that I possess to the state of New York. This I pledge. You know, I even had problems when I was upstate. And people couldn't understand my accent. And I explained it was Glen Cove and Long Island. They don't know what you're saying. You say the cop went down the path, and they don't know what the...
This is an honor and a pleasure that I've never had before. To introduce my son on a platform. I can tell you, of course, a great deal about him. I used to spank him with the ruler. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my 7th child, Robert Francis Kennedy.
I want to thank my mother for the kind introduction. That's what we've gotten down to in this campaign. After some of these polls came out that we were not doing too well, we took Mother.
A lot of experience since I did it 72 years ago.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to tell them you did. I was up in Syracuse, and the county chairman in Syracuse had been opposed to my nomination, George Van Lingen. And then he's one of the great county chairmen. He just didn't happen to like me. But then he spent a day with Mother, and he wants to run her. Yeah, I know. Well, why don't you give your own speech? But see, that's it. We don't... My brother and I never... The reason she's never introduced any of us before is because we never go on the same platform with her. We couldn't possibly compete with...
We're here tonight, and there's very little more except to introduce first Mrs. Ethel Kennedy, who's sitting over here. And secondly, the former Attorney General of the United States and candidate for the United States Senate from New York, Robert F. Kennedy.
The bright group of students.
Sir, could you tell us why you chose to run from New York rather than Massachusetts or Virginia or someplace else?
My brother was in the Navy and originally in intelligence. And he went to make a speech to a group as to what you do when a bomb falls and the fire breaks out. And so he explained what you do, that you throw sand on fire or you throw water on the fire. And if you throw water on the fire that you're supposed to throw the sand on, it spreads it. So you have to be very careful what you do. And then he said at the end of the speech, after he'd spoken for about 15 minutes, he said, now are there any questions? And somebody put up their hand and said, well, how do you tell one fire from the other? And he said, well, there's a fellow coming next week who'll explain that. But I will explain that. In the first place, I have a close association and identification with the state of New York. I've lived in the state of New York much longer than I lived any other place. I lived here for the first 20 years of my life. I went away then to college, and I went away to law school, and I went away to work. I've worked the last 13 years in Washington now. So even if I was living in the state of New York for a longer period of time, I'd still be in Washington, as I have been. Our place of business, we had a home here in the state of New York, my family, since I was a year old. We've had a home or an apartment here since that time, and our major place of business for my family has been the state of New York. But even beyond that, which I think is more important, if the election's going to be decided based on my accent or where I also have other associations with, I think that the people are going to vote for my opponent. I think that the election really should be decided on the basis of my opponent or myself can do more for the state of New York and make the greatest amount of difference for this state and for this country over the period of the next 6 years. Again, if it's going to be judged on who's lived here in the state of New York longer than my opponent has, but then maybe you should elect the oldest man in the state of New York.
Mr. Kennedy, I'd like to ask you a question which seems to me very close to the heart of the matter, and if it sounds blunt, so be it. Aren't you really using New York State as a kind of jumping-off place for your own presidential ambitions?
First, let me say I have really two choices over the period of the last 10 months. I could have stayed in, I could have retired, and my father has done very well, and I could have lived off him.
This is a day of affirmation, a celebration of liberty. We stand here in the name of freedom. At the heart of that Western freedom and democracy is the belief that the individual man, the child of God, is the touchstone of value, and all society, all groups and states exist for that person's benefit. Therefore, the enlargement of liberty for individual human beings must be the supreme goal and the abiding practice of any Western society. The first element of this individual liberty is the freedom of speech, the right to express and communicate ideas, to set oneself apart from the dumb beasts of field and forest, the right to recall governments to their duties and to their obligations. Above all, the right to affirm one's membership and allegiance to the body politic, to society, to the men with whom we share our land, our heritage, and our children's future. Hand in hand with freedom of speech goes the power to be heard, to share in the decisions of government which shape men's lives. Everything that makes man's life worthwhile, family, work, education, a place to rear one's children, and a place to rest one's head, all this depends on the decisions of government. All can be swept away by a government which does not heed the demands of its people, and I mean all of its people. Therefore, this essential humanity of man can be protected and preserved only where government must answer, not just to the wealthy, not just to those of a particular religion, not just to those of a particular race, but to all of the people. And even government, by the consent of the governed, as in our own Constitution, must be limited in its power to act against its people, so that there may be no interference with the right to worship, but also no interference with the security of the home. No arbitrary imposition of pains or penalties on an ordinary citizen by officials high or low no restriction on the freedom of men to seek education or to seek work or opportunity of any kind, so that each man may become all that he is capable of becoming.
Well, I think that there is tremendous deprivation in those parts of the country, inadequate housing, and what we have here, of course, is a considerable amount of hunger. We have the children with distended stomachs in the large cities of the country, particularly in the north, where there is poverty. Still people can live on welfare so that the children don't suffer. Here, children as well as grown-ups are suffering, and as well as the housing being, of course, completely inadequate and without any schooling because of the fact that the children have insufficient clothing. So, as I say, I think it's a terrible reflection on our society. I think that one of the great problems is for most of us as American citizens, we don't run across it. We don't, for a citizen living under reasonably good conditions in our big cities, we don't pass through Bedford-Stuyvesant, we don't pass through Harlem. For a citizen living here in the state of Mississippi, you don't ordinarily run up against, if you're doing reasonably well, you don't run up against this kind of poverty. And certainly people elsewhere in the country have very little personal knowledge or information about it. But it exists, and it seems to me that we should do something about it. It's long overdue, and I don't think an inadequate poverty program or a poverty program that's on the books and sounds good, but is inadequately funded, it might solve our conscience, and we might say that we are doing what we should, but the fact is that we're not doing what we should be doing in this country to deal with this problem.
Violence breeds violence. Repression breeds retaliation. And only a cleansing of our whole society can remove this sickness from our souls. For there is another kind of violence, slower, but just as deadly destructive as the shot or the bomb in the night. This is the violence of institutions, indifference, inaction, and decay. This is the violence that afflicts the poor, that poisons relations between men because their skin has different colors. This is the slow destruction of a child by hunger, and schools without books, and homes without heat in the winter. This is the breaking of a man's spirit by denying him the chance to stand as a father and as a man amongst other men. But we can perhaps remember, if only for a time, that those who live with us are our brothers, and surely we can begin to work a little harder to bind up the wounds among us and to become in our hearts brothers and countrymen once again.